When we speak of the empath, we are not speaking of a fragile creature who has been shaped only by wounds and softness. We are speaking of a psyche that has carried ancient currents beneath the visible surface, currents that do not belong to the ordinary terrain of personality, but to the deeper geography where archetypes breathe, where ancestral memories coil like serpents sleeping in the roots of an old tree. To say that the empath is entering the season where their hidden power finally awakens is not merely to state that they are changing. It is to acknowledge that a threshold has been crossed, a boundary in the unconscious that has been quietly preparing itself for many years. You feel it, perhaps as a subtle trembling beneath your daily actions, a sense that something inside you is no longer willing to stay dormant. And this feeling is not an illusion. It is the psyche's natural movement toward wholeness. The self calling back all the energies that were once scattered by fear, trauma, or inherited expectations. For many empaths, life has been a long initiation, a journey of absorbing emotions that were never theirs, navigating environments where their sensitivity became both compass and burden. But the psyche does not allow such imbalance to continue indefinitely. Nature, whether internal or external, always pushes toward equilibrium. And when the empath has endured enough seasons of carrying the emotions of others, the unconscious begins to stir like a creature awakening from long hibernation. It begins to demand the return of power. Not power in the worldly sense, not domination or aggression, but the power that belongs to the inner realm, the authority of one who sees clearly, who senses deeply, who can no longer be manipulated by the shadows of others. To awaken this power is to step into a new psychological configuration, one that feels at first unfamiliar. It is like emerging from a fog, only to realize that the fog was never outside, but was your own attempt to survive an environment that required invisibility. Many empaths learned to dim themselves because they were surrounded by those who feared intensity, by those who projected onto them the unresolved fragments of their own psyche. And so the empath became a quiet mirror, reflecting wounds, absorbing storms, holding back their natural radiance, because somewhere in childhood or in early emotional experiences, they learned that shini, enji, too brightly provoked conflict or rejection. But the psyche does not forget its true proportions. Even when buried, the instinct to express one's full being remains alive. When this instinct stirs, it often begins in dreams. A person will dream of fire, of animals shedding old skins, of crossing rivers, of walking alone through ancient corridors, carrying a lantern that glows more brightly with each step. These images do not come without reason. They are messages from the unconscious, preparing the ego for the shift that is approaching. Jung often said that dreams are the language of the soul, and the soul speaks in symbols long before the conscious mind catches up. So when the empath begins dreaming of awakening, of rising, of reclaiming, of confronting shadows, they are not imagining transformation. They are already in it. This season of awakening does not announce itself dramatically. It begins quietly, like a change in the quality of light on an autumn afternoon. You start to notice that what once drained you no longer has the same power. You begin to sense that the emotional weight you've carried is no longer yours to hold. And slowly, you realize that you are standing on the threshold of a new identity, one that is not built on absorbing pain, but on transmuting it. This is the difference between an unconscious empath and an awakened empath. The former carries emotion like a sponge. The latter moves energy like a conductor. The former is overwhelmed by subtle currents. The latter commands them. But to reach this point, The empath must pass through an inner doorway that has been locked for many years. This doorway leads directly into the shadow, the realm of rejected impulses, suppressed desires, and forgotten strengths. It is here that the empath discovers something profound, that their hidden power has been trapped in the very places they feared most. The shadow is never merely darkness. It is also potential. It contains the instincts you were not allowed to express, the anger you swallowed to keep peace, the intuition you doubted because others could not understand it. And when the empath finally steps into the shadow, something remarkable happens. The darkness begins to speak. It does not speak in words but in sensations. A sudden clarity, a boundary that rises from nowhere, a refusal to tolerate what once was accepted, a new sense of self that feels unfamiliar yet ancient. The dormant power of the empath does not awaken in bursts of light. It awakens through the integration of what was previously rejected. Jung taught that one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. And this is the exact process the empath is undergoing. They are beginning to see what was once unseen, beginning to reclaim what was once split off. Imagine, for a moment, a dream I once analyzed with a young woman who had lived her entire life as an absorber of emotion. In her dream, she was standing in a vast, empty hall filled with mirrors. In every mirror, she saw herself carrying heavy stones on her back. But when she reached the final mirror, the stones transformed into small, glowing orbs of light. She turned toward me after describing this dream and asked what it meant. I told her that the stones were not burdens but potentials, compressed energies she had never acknowledged as hers. The dream was showing her that what she thought was weight was actually power. And this is the same revelation the empath experiences when entering their awakening season. What once felt like heaviness becomes strength. What once seemed like fragility becomes insight. There is a moment in every transformation where the psyche reveals its true orientation. For the empath, this moment arrives when they stop asking, "Why do I feel so much?" and begin asking, "What is this feeling trying to teach me?" The shift from victim to alchemist happens quietly but decisively. And once this shift occurs, the entire structure of their psychological life begins to rearrange itself. Old roles crumble. Old relationships reveal their true nature. Old habits of self-sacrifice no longer feel natural. It is as if the empath's inner architecture is being rebuilt from the foundation upward, using materials that were always there but never fully recognized. And so the empath begins to stand straighter, both inwardly and outwardly. They begin to listen more to the self than to the demands of their surroundings. They begin to differentiate between empathy and enmeshment, between compassion and self-erasure. It is a process that requires great honesty, for the empath must confront the truth that much of their identity was shaped not by their essence, but by their adaptation to emotional environments. To awaken is to step out of these inherited patterns and into the original blueprint of the soul. In this season, the empath's intuition sharpens. They begin to sense people's motives with almost surgical precision, not because they wish to judge, but because clarity is now a natural state. What was once blurred by emotional noise becomes distinct. They no longer confuse resonance with responsibility, and so they listen without absorbing, observe without drowning, feel without being consumed. This is the mark of awakening, the capacity to stand within emotion without losing oneself to it. You might have noticed this shift in yourself already. Perhaps you have recently withdrawn from certain dynamics without needing to explain why. Perhaps you feel a growing detachment from old wounds, as if they belong to another lifetime. Or perhaps you have begun to sense a subtle inner authority, a voice that whispers, "You no longer need to carry that." These are signs of the psyche reclaiming its lost energy. The empath's awakening is not an addition, it is a return. At this stage, many empaths experience a symbolic dream of flight. Some dream of soaring over landscapes they once walked through in fear. Others dream of sprouting wings or discovering they can glide effortlessly over deep water. These dreams are manifestations of psychological liberation. They signal that the unconscious no longer perceives the empath as trapped. The flight is not literal, it is the soul's way of saying, "You are no longer bound." And yet, awakening is not merely a release. It is also a confrontation. For as the empath rises, the shadows of others become more visible. People who once relied on the empath's compliance may react with confusion or hostility. They sense, often unconsciously, that something has shifted. The old energetic contract is dissolving, but the awakened empath no longer feels compelled to soothe these reactions. They see them clearly for what they are: projections, fears, attempts to maintain old patterns. And instead of shrinking, the empath holds their ground with calm firmness. This is the beginning of psychological sovereignty. As this sovereignty develops, a deeper intelligence begins to move through the empath. It feels like guidance, subtle, steady, unmistakable. It is the self taking its rightful place at the center of consciousness. When this happens, synchronicities increase, meaningful coincidences appear more frequently, confirming the direction of transformation. The outer world begins to mirror the inner shift, and the empath realizes that their life has always been guided, even when it felt chaotic. This is the season of becoming not who others expected, but who the soul has always been. And as you step more fully into this season, you will notice that your presence affects others differently. People become more honest around you, or more defensive, or more inspired. This is not accidental. An awakened empath radiates a psychological field that reveals truth. It is not a field of judgment, but of clarity, and clarity disrupts illusions. Where once you absorbed the emotions of others, now you illuminate them. Your very presence becomes catalytic. And so, you enter this season not as a passive observer, but as a participant in your own mythic unfolding. The archetype of the seer, the healer, the alchemist begins to rise within you, not as roles to perform, but as energies to embody. These archetypes were always present, but they needed space, psychic space, emotional space, existential space to emerge. Now that the empath is no longer drowning in external emotion, the inner archetypal figures can take form. They guide, they instruct, they shape the path ahead. In time, you will look back on this moment and realize that the awakening did not begin here. It began the first time you felt too much, loved too deeply, or sensed what others could not. All those sensitivities were the early signs of a dormant power, a power that is now stirring, rising, reclaiming its place in your life. As the empath crosses deeper into this inner season of awakening, a remarkable phenomenon begins to unfold. The psyche starts returning fragments of the self that were once exiled for survival. These fragments are not broken pieces, as people often fear, but living aspects of the soul that were tucked away to protect the individual when the outer world became too overwhelming. You may feel this return as a sudden rush of instinct, a clarity of emotion, a resurgence of creativity, or even an unexplained strength that rises in moments where you once collapsed. The psyche is not giving you new qualities, it is simply releasing what was already yours. The empath who has spent a lifetime suppressing their own needs, dimming their intuition, or muting their inner fire begins to feel a tangible shift in identity, as if something ancient is climbing its way back to the surface. This return, however, is not always gentle. Sometimes it arrives as a dream too vivid to forget. I recall working with a man, an introverted, intuitive type who dreamed of entering a dense forest at night. In the dream, he carried only a small flame cupped in his hands. As he walked, wolves emerged silently from between the trees. They did not threaten him. They circled him with an intelligence that both frightened and fascinated him. When he finally reached the center of the forest, the flame in his hands exploded into a towering fire, illuminating the wolves who now sat in a perfect circle around him, not as predators, but as guardians. When he woke, he was trembling, not from fear, but from recognition. The wolves were the instincts he had spent decades suppressing. The fire was his truth, his authority, his inner leadership. Everything he had been taught to fear about himself, his intensity, his intuition, his perceptiveness, was revealed as power disguised as danger. Such dreams arise during the empath's awakening because the unconscious is attempting to introduce you to the energies you abandoned. It is not uncommon for empaths to dream of animals during this season: wolves, serpents, lions, horses, birds of prey, symbolic embodiments of instinctual power, autonomy, and freedom. These figures have always belonged to you. When they appear, they are asking to be reintegrated. They signal that your psyche no longer wishes to live as prey to the emotional turbulence of others, but as a sovereign being capable of directing your own life. Yet the return of instinct is only one dimension of this awakening. The empath also begins to experience a profound reorientation of their relationship to suffering. For much of their life, they believed that to feel deeply meant to hurt deeply, that pain was the inevitable consequence of sensitivity. But as they awaken, they begin to see the deeper truth, that suffering is not the destination but the teacher. It is not punishment, but signal. It reveals where the psyche is out of alignment. And once the lesson is integrated, the pain dissolves. What remains is awareness. Many empaths, upon awakening, begin to sense that the pain of others no longer sticks to them. It flows through, like water through an open channel, leaving them untouched yet informed. This is not coldness. This is maturity of the emotional function. In this season, you might notice that your relationship to silence changes. Silence no longer feels like emptiness, but like nourishment. The empath who once filled silence with the emotions of others begins to feel held by it. This shift is crucial. Silence is the medium through which the unconscious communicates. It allows the deeper layers of the psyche to reorganize themselves. When the empath finally learns to rest inside their own silence, the transformation accelerates. They begin to sense the subtle movements of their inner world, the stirrings of forgotten archetypes, the emergence of new impulses. This silence becomes a sacred ground, a womb within which the new identity gestates. And in this gestation, the empath starts to notice patterns in their life that once seemed random. Certain relationships repeat with uncanny similarity. Certain experiences recur with strange precision. Certain emotional dynamics appear like echoes from a deeper chamber of the psyche. This is not coincidence. It is the psyche attempting to resolve unfinished patterns. Jung called this phenomenon the recurrence of the motif. The same wound appears again and again until consciousness finally integrates it. What changes during awakening is that the empath stops responding automatically. They begin to observe the pattern rather than becoming entangled in it. This observation marks the beginning of liberation. Deep in this process, the archetype of the wounded healer often rises. Contrary to popular belief, the wounded healer is not one who heals others despite being wounded, but one who heals others because they understand the nature of the wound. Their sensitivity becomes an instrument of insight rather than a source of suffering. They no longer identify with their pain but recognize it as a portal to depth. Many empaths resist this archetype because they associate it with self-sacrifice. But the true wounded healer does not sacrifice. They illuminate. Their power comes not from carrying others, but from seeing truth that others cannot. It is here that another profound shift occurs. The empath begins to sense the difference between empathy and psychic fusion. Empathy is the ability to feel with clarity. Fusion is the inability to differentiate one's own emotions from another's. Most empaths spend years in fusion, mistaking it for compassion. In truth, fusion is a trauma response, an adaptation learned in childhood to maintain safety. But during awakening, the empath feels the first movements of individuation. They begin to sense the boundary between self and other, not as a wall, but as a membrane, permeable, intelligent, alive. This boundary is not constructed, it is revealed. It has always been there, buried beneath fear and conditioning. And once the empath feels this boundary, something extraordinary happens. They no longer absorb emotion unconsciously. The psyche has reclaimed its original architecture. At this stage, the empath may experience a surge of anger, not as aggression but as clarity. This anger is the instinctual fire that was suppressed in childhood. It is not a destructive force but a boundary-setting force, the psychic immune system coming back online. Many empaths fear anger because they associate it with harm, but in psychological reality, anger is a guardian. It protects the integrity of the self. When this anger returns, the empath is not becoming harsh, they are becoming whole. During this period, you may also notice sudden bursts of creativity, writing, drawing, visions, intuitive insights that arrive with striking precision. These are not random. Creativity is the psyche's way of re-establishing communication between the conscious and unconscious. The empath who begins to create is the empath who is beginning to speak the language of their own soul. Every symbol, every image, every intuitive flash is a message from the depths. These messages guide the process of becoming. It is also common for empaths in this stage to experience powerful synchronicities, meaningful coincidences that seem to defy rational explanation. You think of someone moments before they contact you. You stumble upon a book that articulates exactly what your psyche has been struggling with. You meet someone whose presence accelerates your growth. These synchronicities are not magical, they are psychological. They occur when the inner and outer worlds are aligned. The awakened empath is not creating synchronicity. They are perceiving the natural flow of meaning that has always surrounded them. As this inner alignment deepens, the empath begins to develop what I call symbolic vision, the ability to see life not as a series of events but as a series of symbols. You begin to see your relationships as mirrors, your challenges as archetypal trials, your emotions as messages from the unconscious. Symbolic vision transforms ordinary life into a mythic journey. It lifts the empath out of victimhood and places them at the center of their own narrative. The world becomes a living text, full of meaning, layered with depth. In this symbolic vision, even your past begins to rearrange itself. Memories you once considered painful begin to reveal hidden teachings. People you thought harmed you become teachers in hindsight, their shadows shaping your awakening. Moments you once wished to forget emerge as pivotal points in your destiny. This is not denial, it is integration. The psyche is reclaiming its history, turning wounds into wisdom, scars into constellations that map the soul's expansion. And as this integration unfolds, a new presence arises in your consciousness, the archetype of the inner guide. This figure appears in dreams as a wise elder, a luminous stranger, a voice speaking from behind a door, or sometimes as your own future self. The inner guide represents the self, the totality of the psyche guiding the ego toward wholeness. When you hear this voice, subtle, calm, uncompromising, you will know that you have crossed into the deeper terrain of transformation. This voice does not flatter nor condemn, it clarifies. It cuts through illusions with surgical precision. It tells you what you already know but have not yet admitted. Its guidance feels both familiar and frightening because it speaks from a part of you that has always seen the truth. In this season of awakening, your relationship to fear also changes. Fear no longer paralyzes, it informs. You begin to understand that fear is often a gateway. Behind the very things you have avoided lies the energy you have needed to reclaim. Fear marks the boundary of your old identity. Beyond it lies expansion. And so, instead of retreating, you begin to approach fear with curiosity. This shift is monumental. It signals that the unconscious no longer controls you through avoidance. You are beginning to move voluntarily toward what your psyche has prepared you for. It is at this point that a new sensation arises, a subtle, steady feeling of inner authority. This authority is not loud. It does not need to assert itself. It simply exists, like a mountain that cannot be moved by external turbulence. You may feel it in moments when you speak truth without hesitation, when you refuse a dynamic that once trapped you, when you choose yourself without guilt. This authority is the root of the empath's hidden power. It is the voice of the self, calm, grounded, unshakable. And now, standing in this threshold, the empath begins to realize that the power awakening within them is not new. It is ancient. It comes from the archetypal depths, the healer, the seer, the mystic, the sage. These figures have always lived in your psyche, waiting for the moment when the conscious mind was strong enough to embody them without collapsing under the weight of their intensity. Now, that moment has arrived. You stand in the season of your awakening not as someone becoming powerful, but as someone remembering that they always were. As the empath moves more deeply into this season of inner awakening, they begin to sense a profound reorganization taking place beneath the threshold of ordinary awareness. It is as though the psyche itself is rearranging the architecture of identity, shifting old foundations, dissolving outdated roles, and restoring what had long been suppressed. This transformation does not occur in the outer world first. It begins in the inner kingdom, the place where truths are whispered before they are lived. You may feel this as a quiet inner pressure, a subtle yet undeniable force urging you to shed what no longer aligns with your essence. It is not a command but a movement, like the slow turning of the earth beneath your feet, imperceptible yet unstoppable. During this phase, the empath often experiences vivid symbolic dreams. These dreams reflect the psyche's attempt to communicate truths that the conscious mind is not yet ready to articulate. One individual described dreaming of descending into a vast underground cavern illuminated by bioluminescent flowers. Each flower pulsed with light, and as she approached them, She realized they were growing from the wounds she had carried in her body for years. The wounds glowed, not with pain but with beauty. When she reached out to touch one, it blossomed into a luminous creature that lifted itself from the wound and flew upward, dissolving into the cavern's starlit ceiling. Such a dream reveals what is happening at a psychic level. The wounds that once held you captive are now becoming sources of illumination. The empath's pain is no longer a prison, it is becoming a portal. This transformation is rarely understood by those who remain anchored in superficial perception. They may see the empath withdrawing, becoming more selective, speaking less, or enforcing boundaries with unusual clarity. To the uninitiated, these changes may appear harsh or unexpected, but what is actually happening is a rebalancing of psychic energy. The empath is no longer giving away their vitality in unconscious patterns of caretaking or self-erasure. They are returning to themselves. This return is not selfish, it is sacred. It is the restoration of the self's rightful place at the center of consciousness. At this point in the awakening process, the empath begins to notice that their intuition no longer whispers, it speaks. It becomes fuller, more embodied, more undeniable. Where once intuition appeared as a faint impression or subtle nudge, it now arrives as a clear recognition, a knowing that bypasses the linear mind entirely. This is a sign that the empath's psyche has become coherent. The fragmentation that once diluted intuition has been replaced by alignment, and alignment allows the unconscious to communicate with greater precision. You may find yourself sensing the deeper truth in people's words, feeling the hidden currents in a room, or understanding the direction of your life with an almost eerie clarity. This is not imagination. It is the natural function of a psyche no longer burdened by noise. But to reach this state, the empath must shed many illusions, particularly the illusion that sensitivity equals weakness. This is one of the most destructive misunderstandings in modern culture. Sensitivity, in psychological terms, is a refined instrument of perception. It allows access to subtleties that others overlook. But when sensitivity is paired with trauma or conditioning that teaches self-abandonment, it becomes a source of suffering. During awakening, the empath learns to differentiate between sensitivity and self-sacrifice. They begin to see that the pain of the past was not caused by feeling deeply, but by feeling deeply without boundaries. When boundaries are restored, sensitivity becomes a gift, a compass, a source of insight. At the same time, the empath may experience periods of profound emotional release. This release is not regression, it is cleansing. Old emotions rise to the surface because they can finally be processed. These emotions are not returning to punish you, they are returning to be freed. As they move through the body and the psyche, they release energy that had been trapped for years. This release often opens the way for powerful intuitive breakthroughs. Many empaths report sudden realizations that feel like revelations, as though the psyche is presenting a long-hidden truth with crystalline clarity. These revelations often concern identity, who you are beneath the expectations of family, culture, and past relationships. Another crucial shift in this season involves the empath's relationship to time. The past no longer feels like a weight pulling you backward. It becomes a tapestry you can observe without being entangled. The future no longer feels threatening or unpredictable. It feels open, expansive, filled with potential. You begin to live more fully in the present, not as an escape from the past or a preparation for the future, but as a natural state of being. This presence is the hallmark of a psyche that has reclaimed its energy. The empath's hidden power is not merely emotional or intuitive, it is also temporal. It grants the ability to remain centered in the now, where all transformation begins. As presence deepens, so too does a subtle sense of inner companionship. This companionship is not loneliness. It is the recognition of the self, the inner core that Jung described as the totality of the psyche. The self begins to feel like an ancient ally, a presence that has guided you quietly through every chapter of your life. As the empath awakens, this presence draws closer. You may feel it in quiet moments, in meditation, in stillness, in dreams. It speaks without words, communicates without sound. Its guidance is experienced as intuitive certainty. When the self is near, the empath feels both small and infinite. Small in the sense of humility, infinite in the sense of connection to something vast. In this season, many empaths also begin to sense the movement of archetypes within their psyche. Archetypes are not characters, they are psychic forces, living patterns that shape human experience. The empath may feel the rise of the healer, the sage, the warrior, the seer, or the alchemist. These archetypes do not demand roles. They awaken capacities. The healer awakens the ability to see the wounds in others without becoming entangled in them. The warrior awakens the strength to protect the boundaries of the self. The seer awakens the capacity to perceive the symbolic truth beneath surface appearances. The alchemist awakens the power to transform emotion into wisdom. These archetypal energies deepen the empath's intuition and give structure to their awakening. The emergence of archetypes also brings an intensified relationship to meaning. The empath begins to see life symbolically. Events are no longer random, they carry messages. Encounters are not accidents, they are reflections. Challenges are not punishments, they are initiations. This symbolic awareness transforms suffering from something to endure into something to understand. It transforms confusion into clarity, fragmentation into integration. And it is here, in this symbolic vision, that many empaths experience a profound shift in identity. They begin to see themselves not as caretakers of others' emotions, but as stewards of inner truth. They realize that their capacity to feel deeply was never meant to be used for survival, it was meant to be used for transformation. This realization marks the beginning of psychological sovereignty. The empath stops living reactively and begins living consciously. They no longer respond to emotional currents by absorbing them. Instead, they interpret them, understand them, and choose how to engage with them. This choice marks the birth of inner authority. It is the moment when the empath stops asking for permission to exist as they are. They begin to trust their perception, their instinct, their intuition. They stop doubting their inner voice. This inner authority is quiet but unshakable. It does not need validation because it arises from the depths of the psyche, not from the external world. As this inner authority solidifies, relationships undergo significant transformation. The empath begins to draw boundaries where none existed before. They no longer tolerate dynamics that drain or diminish them. They begin to attract people who resonate with their true nature rather than their wounded identity. Some relationships fall away not because of conflict, but because the frequency of the empath psyche has changed. When you awaken, your energy no longer fits into containers built for your unconscious self. This is not loss, it is clearing. The psyche is making room for what aligns with your newfound integrity. Yet even as relationships shift, the empath feels a growing sense of inner peace. This peace is not the absence of challenge, but the presence of alignment. It comes from the recognition that you no longer need to fight yourself. You no longer need to betray your inner truth. to maintain external harmony. You no longer search for belonging outside, because you have finally returned home within. In this season of awakening, the empath begins to understand the true nature of power. Power is not domination or control. It is presence. It is coherence. It is the ability to remain rooted in the self while engaging with the world. When the empath embodies this power, they become a stabilizing force in their environment. People may sense this shift before they understand it. They may respond with admiration, discomfort, or curiosity. Your presence begins to reveal truth without effort. This is the empath's hidden power, an energy that once slept beneath layers of fear and conditioning. It is awakening now because you are ready to carry it, not as a burden, but as a birthright. You are entering a season where your sensitivity becomes strength, your insight becomes clarity, your wounds become wisdom, and your presence becomes power. You are not transforming into someone new, you are returning to who you were before the world taught you to fear your own depth. And in this return, the empath begins to sense the whisper of an approaching threshold, the moment where awakening becomes embodiment. As the empath approaches the deeper threshold of their awakening, something subtle but extraordinary begins to unfold. The center of gravity within the psyche shifts. The empath, who once organized their emotional life around the needs, moods, and expectations of others, now begins to feel the emergence of an inner axis, a stable, unmoving pillar of selfhood around which everything else revolves. This inner axis is not created, it is revealed. It has always been there, buried beneath years of adaptation, obedience, emotional fusion, and the unconscious desire to maintain harmony. But as the empath withdraws energy from these outdated patterns, the pillar emerges like an ancient structure rising from beneath the ocean after centuries of submersion. Once this axis appears, the empath experiences a new kind of emotional orientation. Feelings no longer flood the psyche without direction. They circle around this center, allowing the empath to decide consciously what to absorb, what to observe, and what to release. This newfound agency feels unfamiliar at first. You may even doubt it, questioning whether you are becoming detached or cold. But detachment is not coldness, it is clarity. It is the ability to witness emotion without dissolving into it. In truth, this is the empath's natural state, the state they lost when they merged too deeply with the emotional world of others. This inner reorientation often triggers symbolic dreams of elevation, climbing mountains, ascending staircases, floating above landscapes, or witnessing the earth from a great height. These images reflect the psyche's movement toward perspective, toward a higher vantage point from which old patterns become visible. When the empath sees their past from this elevated symbolic space, they notice something they could not see before. Their suffering was not random. It followed a pattern, a psychological choreography that guided them toward this exact moment. Every wound became an opening. Every emotional collapse became a portal. Every relationship that overwhelmed them served as an initiation into deeper awareness. It is in this elevated state that the empath begins to confront the archetype of the shadow in its full form, not merely as the wounded child or the silenced emotions, but as the vast reservoir of instinct, creativity, anger, eros, vision, intuition, and power that was rejected early in life. Many empaths fear the shadow because they associate it with chaos or destructiveness. But the shadow is only destructive when ignored. When brought into consciousness, it becomes the source of vitality. Jung taught that the shadow is 90% pure gold. For the empath, this gold often takes the form of long suppressed anger, long silenced truth, long denied intuition, long ignored desire, and long awaited boundaries. This confrontation with the shadow is not an easy passage. It can feel like standing in front of a mirror that reflects not your face but your potentials, potentials you were never allowed to embody. You may see versions of yourself that frighten you because they contradict the identity you built for safety. You may see the strength you were told was dangerous, the voice you were encouraged to silence, the intuitive power that others mocked or feared. The leadership you learned to hide, the fire you buried to keep peace. These revelations can shake the ego, and yet they are essential. Without integrating these qualities, the empath remains incomplete. Awakening demands wholeness. In the midst of this integration, many empaths experience a surge of instinctual energy rising from the depths of the psyche. This energy often manifests as a newfound assertiveness, a sudden refusal to tolerate disrespect, a clarity of boundaries that surprises even you, or a boldness in expression that feels both exhilarating and terrifying. This is the shadow returning as strength. It is the fire that once burned unseen. It is the instinct you suppressed because you were taught that sensitivity and strength could not coexist. But they can, in fact, they must. Sensitivity without strength collapses. Strength without sensitivity becomes rigid. The awakened empath embodies both. One of the most profound shifts in this season is the empath's changing relationship to love. For much of their life, the empath believed that love required sacrifice, merging, understanding without being understood, giving more than they received, and enduring the emotional storms of others without complaint. This was not love, it was survival. It was the archetype of the mother wound or father wound playing itself out through adult relationships. But as the empath awakens, the psyche dissolves these outdated forms of love. You begin to feel a different kind of love rising within you, a love rooted in presence, in truth, in equal exchange. This love does not bind, it liberates, it does not drain, it nourishes. It does not demand your self-abandonment, it requires your authenticity. Consequently, you may begin to feel disinterested in relationships that once consumed you. Drama loses its allure. Emotional chaos becomes intolerable. You no longer feel compelled to fix, save, or absorb. You begin to crave honesty, resonance, depth, solitude, clarity. This shift can confuse those who relied on your old patterns. They may accuse you of being distant, changed, or unrecognizable. And in a sense, they are right. You are unrecognizable not because you have become someone else, but because you have stopped pretending to be someone you are not. Your new orientation reveals their old dependence. And while this may cause temporary tension, it is ultimately a purification of your relational life. During this time, the empath's spiritual perception intensifies. You may begin to feel the symbolic dimension of reality more vividly. Birds appearing in moments of clarity, patterns repeating at crucial thresholds, dreams foreshadowing events, intuition guiding you with uncanny precision, synchronicities multiplying like signs on a path you once doubted existed. This is the psyche aligning with the self. When inner coherence is achieved, the outer world becomes a mirror, reflecting your psychological state with extraordinary accuracy. This mirroring is not mystical, it is natural. The psyche and the world are not separate. They are two sides of the same symbolic fabric. And as this fabric reveals itself, the empath begins to sense a purpose emerging from the depths. This sense of purpose is not tied to career or achievement. It is an inner calling, a feeling that your experiences, your wounds, your insights, and your sensitivity were preparing you for something that only now begins to take shape. You may feel drawn to roles that require intuition, presence, depth, creativity, leadership, or healing. You may feel compelled to express truths that once frightened you. You may sense that your life is shifting from survival to contribution, from carrying emotion to transforming it, from absorbing pain to illuminating it. This purpose is not chosen, it is revealed. This revelation often coincides with the appearance of the wise inner figure in dreams. The mentor archetype. This figure may appear as an elder, a luminous guide, a cloaked figure, or even as your own older self. They offer direction through symbols, gestures, or a simple presence that conveys assurance. Their arrival signifies that the psyche trusts your readiness. Guidance is only given when the student has developed enough consciousness to receive it. When this archetype appears, the empath is no longer wandering. They are walking a path intentionally, accompanied by the deeper intelligence of the self. This unfolding brings the empath into a new relationship with their past. Memories that once caused shame or confusion begin to reveal their deeper meaning. You start to understand why you felt so deeply, why certain relationships broke you open, why certain wounds persisted, why certain people entered your life at exactly the moments they did. You see that your sensitivity was never a flaw, it was the instrument through which your psyche learned truth. Every pain carried information. Every collapse carried transformation. Every silence carried wisdom. As the empath integrates this perspective, a profound emotional maturity emerges. You no longer fear your depth. You no longer apologize for your truth. You no longer shrink to maintain peace. You begin to radiate a quiet confidence, a confidence rooted not in ego but in inner alignment. People may feel this radiance before you even speak. It is not charisma, not charm, not performance. It is coherence, and coherence is magnetic. This coherence awakens another dimension of the empath's power, the ability to influence energetically. You begin to notice that your presence affects others, not through force, but through resonance. People become calmer in your presence, or more honest, or more unsettled if they are hiding from their truth. You do not do anything consciously, your very being, aligned with the self, becomes a tuning fork that reveals the inner state of those around you. This is why awakening is both a gift and a responsibility. Your energy becomes a mirror, and mirrors do not lie. At this stage, the empath often enters a temporary period of solitude, not loneliness, but intentional solitude. The psyche withdraws from external noise to deepen its integration. You may feel less interested in social interaction, more drawn to introspection, creativity, nature, or silence. This solitude is not regression. It is incubation. Just as the chrysalis requires darkness for transformation, the empath requires solitude for alignment. In this space, the psyche completes the work that began years, perhaps decades earlier. It is often during this solitude that the empath experiences the first taste of true inner freedom. This freedom is not rebellion or escape. It is the absence of internal conflict. It is the moment when the ego no longer fights the unconscious, when your thoughts, emotions, instincts, intuition, and deeper self are no longer at war. when you can feel without collapsing, speak without fear, love without losing yourself, and stand alone without trembling, this freedom cannot be taught, it must be lived. And as this freedom expands, the empath begins to sense a new identity forming, not the identity shaped by wounds or expectations, but the identity shaped by essence. This identity is quiet, powerful, grounded, intuitive, and deeply aware. It is the empath's truest form. You are not moving into power. Your power is moving into you. It has been waiting. And now, the psyche prepares to reveal the final stage of this awakening, the moment where the empath steps out of inner transformation and into embodied destiny. As the empath approaches the culmination of this season, something extraordinary occurs. The inner and outer worlds begin to converge. No longer does the empath experience life solely through the lens of absorption, reflection, or reaction. Instead, the psyche moves toward synthesis, integrating all that has been learned, felt, and reclaimed. The hidden power that was once buried beneath fear, conditioning, and suppression begins to manifest in tangible ways. It is no longer simply an internal shift, it is an awakening that radiates outward, affecting both the empath and the world in subtle, profound, and far-reaching ways. This power is first noticed in perception. The empath begins to perceive with a depth and clarity previously unimaginable. They see patterns where once there was chaos, connections where there were only random fragments, meanings that were obscured now illuminated by the light of awareness. People, situations, and events reveal themselves in their full symbolic significance. You may observe someone's behavior not merely at face value, but as a reflection of archetypal forces, as if the veil has lifted and the hidden choreography of human consciousness is visible. The empath's insight becomes a lens that penetrates layers of illusion, not for judgment but for understanding. With perception comes discernment. The awakened empath no longer confuses resonance with responsibility. They no longer carry the burdens of others as their own by default. Instead, they move within a field of emotion, intuition, and energy with clarity, grace, and authority. Where once you might have absorbed anxiety, anger, or grief, now you observe, integrate, and release. The empath has learned to operate as a conscious conductor of the emotional and psychic energies that surround them. This is the hallmark of hidden power, one that operates quietly, subtly, yet with undeniable influence. Simultaneously, a deep inner alchemy takes place. The empath's wounds, once a source of suffering and limitation, become the source of strength. Emotional scars are transmuted into wisdom. Past traumas become guideposts. Sensitivity becomes the instrument of profound insight. The psyche orchestrates this transformation, not hurriedly, not artificially, but with the precision of a master craftsman. It is as if each pain, each disappointment, each suppressed instinct has been catalogued and stored until the time is ripe for reclamation. The empath realizes that nothing was wasted. All experience, all suffering, all resonance with others' pain has prepared them for the awakening of their latent power. Dreams during this period often carry potent symbols of empowerment and mastery. Many empaths report recurring imagery of flight, of walking through fire unscathed, of wielding light or energy with purpose, or of standing at the edge of vast landscapes, observing without fear or hesitation. These dreams are not fantastical entertainment, They are the language of the unconscious, affirming the shift. They signal that the empath is internalizing their own authority, stepping fully into a sovereign identity. The archetypes that were once hidden, the seer, the healer, the warrior, the sage, take a conscious seat within the psyche, guiding decision-making, behavior, and the embodiment of power. This awakening also brings clarity regarding relational dynamics. The empath recognizes with precision which connections are nourishing and which are draining, which interactions are based on mutual resonance and which are driven by projection or manipulation. There is no longer the compulsion to overgive, over-accommodate, or over-absorb. The empath begins to engage with others from a position of choice rather than obligation, understanding that their presence can illuminate but not fix the unconscious shadows of others. In this way, relationships become mirrors of growth rather than prisons of obligation. Moreover, the empath begins to experience a profound temporal awareness. Past experiences, once perceived as wounds or failures, now appear as essential steps on the path of individuation. The present becomes a space of conscious engagement where the empath can respond, create, and observe with intention. The future becomes an open canvas, not governed by anxiety or projection, but shaped by the conscious integration of past lessons and present awareness. Time itself feels elastic, aligned with the rhythm of consciousness rather than the arbitrary march of external events. The embodiment of this hidden power is accompanied by an expanded spiritual perception. The empath senses the interconnectedness of all things, not as abstract philosophy but as a lived experience. Symbols, synchronicities, and archetypal patterns become tangible guides, pointing toward paths aligned with the self. Nature, dreams, relationships, and events resonate with meaning, providing the empath with a continuous feedback loop of insight and guidance. The inner authority that emerges is not authoritarian, it is integrative, allowing the empath to navigate life with an elegance born of alignment. At this stage, creativity flourishes. The empath may find themselves drawn to acts of creation, writing, art, music, healing practices, or teaching that express the depth of their inner world. This creativity is not merely aesthetic, it is transformational. It channels the energies reclaimed from the shadow, the wounds, the inherited patterns, and the suppressed instincts. Each creative act is both personal catharsis and energetic transmission. A bridge between the inner awakening and the external world. The empath's power is made tangible through these expressions, which resonate with others at a level beyond ordinary understanding. A crucial component of this final stage is mastery over fear. The empath no longer reacts unconsciously to perceived threats, emotional turbulence, or uncertainty. Fear becomes a guidepost, signaling areas for conscious engagement rather than triggering avoidance or overabsorption. The empath moves through challenging circumstances with discernment and presence, able to maintain integrity while engaging fully with life. This mastery over fear is inseparable from the awakening of hidden power. It represents the reclaiming of instincts and energies that were once suppressed for safety. As the empath integrates these capacities, they begin to experience what Jung described as the self-regulating the personality. Decisions are guided not by habitual patterns of survival, but by a deep attunement to the unconscious intelligence that orchestrates life. Choices emerge with precision and ease, aligning with both inner purpose and outer circumstance. The empath becomes a living embodiment of the principle that consciousness can harmonize instinct, emotion, intellect, and intuition. Finally, the empath's awakening manifests as a quiet sovereignty, a presence that commands attention without effort, influence without manipulation, and insight without imposition. This is the hidden power fully revealed, a state in which sensitivity and strength, intuition and clarity, emotion and discernment coexist in dynamic equilibrium. The empath no longer fears their own depth, nor do they fear the depth of others. Their presence catalyzes transformation in their environment simply by being aligned with the wholeness of the psyche. It is important to recognize that this awakening is not a final destination but a continual process. The empath remains engaged in the ongoing work of consciousness, integrating new experiences, encountering new shadows, and reclaiming deeper layers of the self. Yet the season described here represents a pivotal threshold, the moment when hidden power ceases to be latent and begins to operate consciously in life. It is the point at which the empath, having traversed the labyrinth of sensitivity, shadow, and inherited patterns, steps fully into the sovereignty of the psyche, carrying both the depth of feeling and the clarity of insight as natural allies. In this awakened state, the empath is a living testament to the psyche's capacity for reclamation, transformation, and integration. They embody the truth that what was once suppressed, ignored, or feared is not a weakness, but a wellspring of power waiting for recognition. The long journey of absorption, survival, and adaptation culminates in alignment. Sensitivity becomes wisdom, vulnerability becomes strength, intuition becomes authority. And the empath, standing at the threshold of the fully realized self, enters the world not as a passive witness, but as a luminous presence whose hidden power has finally awakened. You now understand what it means to enter this season. You begin to move in the world as one who has remembered themselves, who has reclaimed what was scattered, and who carries the authority of the self in every gesture, thought, and heartbeat. This is not a claim of superiority, it is a recognition of wholeness. The empath is no longer merely a mirror for the emotions of others. They are a conduit for consciousness itself, aligned with the deep currents of the psyche, resonating with the eternal rhythm of life. Your hidden power has always existed. Now it is fully awake,